I've seen multiple comments lately of people saying they don't like the hellos. I have a feeling that's just a vocal minority. But feel free to keep on commenting about that. If there's enough naysayer, enough people who don't like the hellos, I guess we'll shift it up. Stop doing them. It's just part of the shtick, folks. I mean, it's not. No big deal one way or the other if people don't want the hellos. But I got a feeling most of you, the majority of you, do want them still. I would like to remind people who are anti-hello, my podcast does not have hellos. And my podcast is much more somber and serious about these law of assumption, law of attraction, manifesting, spiritual principles. These car videos are a lark. Just a walk in the park, folks. But they're informative at the same time. And often a walk in the park can tell us more and teach us more than something very somber and serious. That's really a key part of what I talk about. That actually is why I do the hellos at the beginning. It's part of the be less serious and your life will get better philosophy that I try to live and show others that they can, utilize if they want to. I also want to remind people, as I ramble on, that if you're relatively new here, I am offering free 15-minute consultations to people I've never spoken to before on the phone or Zoom to see if I can be a help. And, can be very helpful for people when we are discussing subjects like we're going to discuss today. Because a lot of these ideas, we were actually talking about this in the group session we had last night for the SP and self-concept course. A lot of these ideas, especially like when we hear them on YouTube, they sound great in theory. But then you actually got to implement them. And YouTube is full of theorists. And that's great to a certain degree, but then you got to actually implement it. And when you implement it, this is what we were talking about last night. When you implement it, it gets messy. It gets messy. We were speaking specifically about relationships last night, and there's a lot of cool SP advice, for instance, that sounds just great on paper, right? But when you actually take that theory and try to implement it into your life and how you deal with people, how you deal with a potential romantic partner or with your spouse or with whoever, 90% of that theory you can almost throw away a lot of the time. Because it's like, oh shit, this is actually happening. I got to deal with this. And you can call me negative by thinking that way, but if you call me negative by thinking that way, all I got to tell you is, don't watch my videos. There's a big difference between being negative about this stuff and being real, honest with your experiences. Big difference between being honest and forthright and being negative. I never try to be negative for the sake of being negative, and I don't think I am negative whatsoever. So many nuances and subtleties to this stuff. That's what makes it interesting. And, I really like working with people just when we get into that muck, when we get into the mud. Like in Buddhism, they always talk about how the lotus flower, it grows in the shit, grows in the mud. That's what's interesting. Theory, great to a certain point, but then most of us at least, you got to get beyond the theory and freaking do it. So let's talk about that today in regards to something we often hear, which is great in theory. Something that Neville talked about a lot, and then in my opinion is totally misinterpreted on YouTube now in regards to manifesting advice, and you hear it a lot in the SP community. And that is Just persist. Just persist. Just persist. Keep persisting. Don't be a fucking pussy. Keep persisting. Fucking bullshit advice, man. Awful advice. Awful advice. Not always, but usually when you hear it in these circles. And this is why. And if you think I'm being negative talking about this, see you later. Don't watch my videos anymore. We are persisting a lot of the time, you could say all the time, in our default state. You know, like we're going through various emotions and different emotional states throughout the day, but like we basically have like kind of like a default state. In generally speaking, our default state is kind of like what then externalizes into our life. If we're, buying into these law of assumption, law of attraction type of ideas, what's attracted to us is what we assume. Like our default state is like what we're assuming is going to happen to us, basically. And that's what turns out, in many ways at least, to happen to us, at least on an energetic level, and we'll see it reflected in our external reality in many ways. And when Neville said, just persist, we must be persistent, we must be patient, we must persist, I think he meant it in the sense that we must be persistent in accessing that assumption, that state, that high state that we want, that we desire, until it becomes more and more part of our living reality, until we feel it more and more, until we feel that state in our life more and more. We have to persist till that becomes the case. We can't just be like, oh, I feel it, and, then some bad shit happens and we lose that feeling and we give up. We have to persist in feeling what we want more and more. This is a core part of Neville's approach. And if we don't persist, it's unlikely that what we want to see externalize, what we want to see demonstrated or manifested, is going to show up. But if we do persist and keep focused on what we want, but feel internally like it's going to happen as opposed to it's not going to happen, persist in thinking and feeling that it is going to happen, then it will, in all likelihood, externalize in some significant way in our outer reality. That's persistence from this LOA, law of assumption perspective. Persist in the state, the feeling that you want. However, the way it's often taught on YouTube and in other social media circles is just persist by just keep on doing some technique like robotic affirming or some other technique, even though it doesn't feel good, even though you're coming from a state of lack, the state you don't want. So in other words, you're saying like, I want an SP. I want this perfect 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 SP. But your default state, the state you're persisting in while you're doing that, is one of lack, is one of, I actually don't have this SP. I actually don't feel good about my romantic relationships. You see? It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to feel it. And the point of something like robotic affirmations is that if you say it enough, you'll start to feel it. So there's something to persisting even though you don't feel it until you start to feel it. But what often happens, especially for stuff like SPs or other big, big things we want to manifest externally, like health or more money, the big stuff, is that we'll keep on saying it, or we'll keep on doing some technique, journaling, and basically like an unfulfilling attempt at SATs or something like that. Something that does not feel good, doesn't feel like it's actually working, and will persist in doing that over and 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 over again. but we're just persisting in this lackful state. And so it's one thing to say, I'm now with my SP. I'm now in my SP. I'm now in my SP. It's another thing to feel it as being true. It's another thing to internally believe it as being true. And it can also be like, I'm going to be with my SP. I'm going to be with my SP. I'm going to be with my SP. It's one thing to say that. It's another thing to believe it. If you believe it, even though it's in the future, if you think it's going to happen, if you believe it, it will happen in all likelihood. But you have to feel and believe it's going to happen. And what I see all the time is people saying, I'm going to do this. I'm going to have my SP, or I have my SP. I have it. And they say it, but then the lackful thought then counteracts it. It says, no, it's not going to happen. And it's Emile Coué's law of reversed effort, the law of reversed effort that Coué and Charles Baudouin spoke so eloquently about, with if you want to will something into being, your willpower is helpful, but if your imagination is not in accord with your willpower, your imagination will always win. And so the law of reversed effort kicks in situations like this, when you're trying to persist, because you're trying to persist willfully from a state that is imaginatively lackful. And the imagination is going to overpower the will. So you're, for instance, robotically affirming, I'm going to be with my SP. You're using willpower, which is fine to use willpower in that way. But if you're saying, I'm going to be with my SP, and you don't believe it, it's because imaginatively, there's a counter suggestion there saying it's not going to happen. You're full of shit. This is not going to happen. And until that counter suggestion is neutralized, you won't actually buy it, what you're saying. The imagination overrides the will. If your imagination is in accord with your willpower, very good chance that your external reality will change. But the law of reversed effort is not something to be taken, just to be passed over. And this is really a lot of what Neville was talking about. And if you look, I was looking the other night at like just the glossary, for instance, from Charles Baudouin's book, Suggestion and Autosuggestion, where he, Baudouin was actually the one who I think came up with that term, the law of reversed effort, in describing what Coué was teaching. And if you look in the glossary of suggestion and autosuggestion, you will realize that so much of what Neville said, including things like the term like contention, is like attention minus effort, for instance. So much of that stuff that Neville said is just from it's from Coué, Baudouin, and all these other great psychologists and hypnotists from 20, 30, 40 years before Neville was teaching. Neville got so much of his stuff from those guys. And, he then, I think, presented it, Neville often did, in a much more dynamic, exciting way. But soberly, this is what's going on. The reason your robotic affirmations or your attempts at SATs or visualization or whatever are not working is because you are actually persisting in the state you don't want, despite your best efforts. Your best efforts of your will are not enough to overcome your imagination saying it's not going to happen. You have to believe it's going to happen. And there are various techniques to help you believe more, including things like robotic affirmations. Like if you say it enough, consistently enough, you start to believe more. But it's not this cut and dry thing. It's not a magic technique. There are no magic techniques. It's about realizing that your imagination is stronger than your willpower, and that it's not what you try hard to do that's going to happen as much as what you imagine will happen that is going to happen. You know, what state are you coming from? Cecilia and I had that recent conversation where we're talking about, like, what state is compelling you? You don't want to persist in a state that is compelling you towards results you don't want. You want to persist in a state where you get the results you want. This is why it's helpful to get out of these small YouTube and social media circles talking about this stuff and think more big picture. Again, that's why you work with someone like me, because we think big picture. We try to get out of the box. And when you read a lot of these older great teachers like Neville or Coué or Charles Baudouin, they want you to step back some, to think of the big picture and think of your whole life. So yeah, I hope that was helpful.